This is my take on a finger joint box joint jig. The way it's configured right now, this blade is 1/10 of an inch cutting into this side, and it produces 1/10 of an inch thick finger joints, box joints that look something like that. Now if that's not the size finger joint you're looking for, you do have an option. You can get this out of the way, remove that blade and put in a blade like this. Turn the sled around and line it up, and now you're ready to cut a finger joint or a box joint that's 1/16 of an inch, or a joint that looks something like these. And here are the two joints side by side in similar pieces of wood. There's two advantages to box joint jigs. One of them is they're very beautiful. Here you can see them on this mahogany box. And they're very strong. Whether you're joining wood in the traditional right angle, as in here, or if for some reason you had to even join two pieces like that, it's hard to imagine a stronger joint.
It's for these reasons why you want to have the ability to make them. There were tons of solutions out there that range from simple to complex, and I'd put the fancier, flexible ones more in the category of machines. They just weren't really a good fit for me. Lately, I've envisioned some projects where I think it would be handy to be able to make some quick finger joints, more for strength. I thought a jig that used the blade that I already have on my table saw would be convenient, and I have room in my shop for a dedicated piece of equipment. And I'd like some flexibility to create different size box joints, although I've never really had the need so far. I think this system offers both.
When I was doing this video, I was getting a little clumsy with terms, so let me take a minute to just give you my ideas for clarity. The whole box joint jig is essentially made up of two pieces. You have the sled or the carriage, but the business end is made up of this, in my case, piece of plywood with the key very specifically positioned in relation to the blade. And it's of course the key that allows you to index as you make the cuts across to give you the kind of joint you're looking for. So for lack of better, I'm going to call this piece of plywood with the key, I'll call this assembly the indexer. And the indexer is mounted in the sled precisely enough to give you the joints you want, and the two pieces together make the box joint jig. For lack of better, I call this type of jig a simple key box joint jig. The indexer is held to the sled by these screws, and the holes are drilled through the sled just big enough to hold the screws, so there's not a lot of lateral movement. The idea is every time you sink these screws into the existing hole in the indexer, it positions it in exactly the same place.
And I've successfully removed and reinstalled the jig back into the sled with pretty gosh darn good alignment. I won't guarantee it will happen that way every time. Anytime you move these jigs, you'll have to run a test cut to be sure it's properly aligned, but I think you pretty much do that for any jig.
Let's talk about how to build a finger joint jig. You need to start with a carriage, and it might look like a sled like this, or this. Or it might be a small double runner sled like these, or even maybe you're attaching it to the miter gauge of your saw. I'm not going to go over how to build one of these, that's another video. Obviously the better the sled is, the better your jig is going to be. You want it to be tight in the runner slots, you want it to be square, and you want to have some holes drilled so that you can put screws in to secure the indexer to the sled. The things you should have on hand is the piece of material you're going to use for the indexer. Plywood is nice and stable. You would do yourself a favor by cleaning up one of the edges, because you're going to use this edge as a reference to shift it, make subtle adjustments. And you want to make sure it's thick enough to be able to hold a screw without the screw protruding through. You're going to need some scraps of wood to cut your test coupons out of. Probably going to want to have plenty of test pieces milled up and ready to go, because it might take several shots to get it right where you wanted. You're going to need screws to go through the jig and support it to the carriage. And finally, you're going to need a material to make the keys out of. If your blade width is thick enough, a piece of hardwood would be fine. This is about 1/8 of an inch thick. I think it's marginal. My two jigs were narrower than that, so I ended up going with a piece of steel. This came from a bracket, and a piece of aluminum that came from this bar stock. Another option, perhaps a drill bit is the right size. You could use that as a key, or even something like a nail or some other piece of material you have. You're going to need some clamps and some glue to set the spacing. I used feeler gauges. I don't think you really need them, but you do need some things that are very thin. Here's a piece of paper folded over 3 times. That's a little over 1/1000th. A piece of aluminum foil is 1/1000th. This business card is around 10. And it would also be worth your while to make this reference block. This gives you a very convenient way to get very small adjustments on where the indexer sits in relationship to the carriage. However you do it, you want to make your key, you want it to fit nice and snug in the saw kerf, and you want to have enough extra material to use as a spacer a couple steps down the road. You want it to be relatively long, at least a ½ inch or so, and you don't want it to be too tall. Then your finger joints by definition have to be at least that tall.
Well, now we want to clamp the indexer to the sled. We want the fingers to be about 4/1000ths of an inch to 6/1000ths of an inch narrower than the slots, so that the joint can be glued together without much of a battle. So the space between the saw blade and the key needs to be the saw curve minus this 4/1000ths to 6/1000ths of an inch. Here you can see me using the cutoff of the same bracket that I use for the key. You could perhaps sand it a tad bit thinner or keep the indexer pressed tightly to the blade to try to get that perfect 5/1000ths of an inch offset. But I personally think that's pressing it when it comes to working with wood. Don't sweat this step too much, since you're almost certainly going to have to adjust it anyway.
And the difference between a joint that you can't squeeze all the way together and one that just falls apart is only a few thousandths of an inch. This test piece I had to use a rubber mallet to get it all the way together. I can't pull it apart with my hands. I'd have to get a mallet out to do it. And I adjusted my jig 3/1000ths of an inch to make the pins a little bit smaller, and this fits together about perfectly. So the good news is, with a jig like this, there's only 1 degree of freedom. The width of the notch is determined by the saw kerf, so your saw blade determines the size of the notch. The only thing you can adjust is how skinny or how fat the fingers are. If you move the key closer to the blade, then the distance between the two is narrower, and your resulting fingers will be skinnier. If you move the key further away from the blade, then the distance between the two is going to be greater, and your fingers are going to be fatter. The tricky part is doing it with precision.
I got this procedure from William Ing. I'll link to his page. It's great. I decided 4/1000ths with the adjustment, so I found that feeler gauge. You place the gauge between the indexer and the reference block, and then you clamp the reference block. Then you remove the feeler gauge, loosen the clamps holding the indexer, and you can move the indexer 4/1000ths over up against the reference block. Reclamp the indexer, and you're ready to go for another test. Simple and accurate. It might take you a couple shots, but you do get better at it with practice. Within a ½ hour or so, you should have this thing dialed right in.
Well, I appreciate you coming by and checking out my latest work. If you like the video, let me know. If you have any questions, let me know. And look forward to seeing you all on the next one.